afternoon. You are watching the Roar webinar series. I'm Josefina Bonilla with my co-host, Dr. Lisa Coleman. Dr. Coleman.
Hello, Josefina. It's so good to see you.
Nice to
Out in
see
the
you.
sun today, as you can see.
I love it. I absolutely love it. We are live. We have some folks on Zoom, and I'm thinking that the best topic, and we briefly discussed it, was on strategy. We've been getting quite a bit of questions regarding where the first place to set up a strategy is.
Yeah,
For
that's a good.
diversity, inclusion, and equity.
Yeah, that's a really good, I think it's really important to think strategically. I always try to do that. So I'll talk about it in two ways. I think the first way is to strategically think about your job. So when you're going into the role, how are you strategizing, right? How are you negotiating? So thinking about everything from the team you want to build to the budget that you're going to have to how you're going to strategize across the organization, who your collaborators are going to be, if you're placed within HR, if you're reporting to the CEO, the CFO, the CHRO. So thinking about that.
Plus Lisa, give me one sec. Let me switch it back to gallery. Plus, it depends on the actual role you're taking.
Because then I was going to say, and then it's the role.
Yeah.
Right? Are you the chief diversity officer? Are you an executive director? Are you placed within HR? Because then maybe they want you to do recruitment, help with recruitment and talent management. If you're reporting the CEO, then they may have a broader scope, right? You might have to interface with constituents, consumers, all of those kinds of things. So it depends on what the role is, where the role is placed, and then how you're thinking about strategizing and navigating the organization. Then the second piece, of course, is then once you're in the role, how do you strategize, right? And I think those are all different kinds of questions, because thinking about how you strategize in the role goes back to the role that you took. So if you're in HR, then you need to think about, how am I strategizing across HR? Do I have multiple HR partners? Do I have a single HR partner? How am I thinking about talent management? What does that have to do with benefits? If I'm reporting to the CEO and I'm working across the organization, who are my key stakeholders within the organization? And who are my key stakeholders outside of the organization?
But Lisa, let me step back a second.
And then there's diversity, inclusion, and equity.
Okay. But let's step back a second. Can we add to the mix the corporation that doesn't have a D&I layer, and they're really not sure where to start, but they know they have to create a strategy around diversity and inclusion? So maybe we can also step into that type of mindset.
So the first thing you need to do is an organizational assessment. And on that organizational assessment, you need to figure out where the organization is on two areas: diversity and equity. Inclusion is another conversation. So diversity usually means how many people, right? That's just quantity. So do you have X number of people of African descent, X number of people of Latin descent, X people who are LGBTQ plus, X people who are disability? And you usually
can you ask that?
You can get that from your HR data. So usually your HR people, even if you're not reporting into HR, they will have that data. The way that they classify disability is usually through accommodation. So the people who are getting accommodations, right? As opposed to, because that's often protected by HIPAA, right? Because you can't just ask random people, do you have a disability, right? And then LGBTQ plus, depending on the organization, you might not have that data through HR, because it may be, unless they're asking for housing or something like that. But often offices do quality of life surveys within the organization, and that's where they capture that identity data, right? Like, are you a gay person? Are you a woman? All of those things, and then it captures the climate data. So usually you can get that from HR, and I say that because HR usually has to file documents outside of the company, right, to sort of say who the company is.
But if they've never done that, because recently I've been noticing that if you apply for a job, then they ask you about your demographics.
Yes.
However, some companies were not doing that.
Yeah,
And so
lots
what
of
we
companies
have
were.
to
No, that's right. And what they were doing, quite frankly, often, Josefina, was guessing, which is not good. Right. The reason that EEO qualification data, that card that you fill out, the
have,
reason companies have to do that is they're supposed to file that data, which is called F1 data, when they're filing their annual reports. But a lot of companies weren't doing it. So they were just guessing at who was in their company. So either way, whether you have it or you don't, you try to get the data, right, to see who's in your company. If HR hasn't been collecting it, then you're going to have to do a survey of some kind to collect the data, right? As
and,
you're
and quite frankly, Lisa, there may be some folks that you can't determine, but if you walk in the company and all you see are Anglo men,
you know.
you know,
Exactly.
you know.
Exactly.
So
Like if
there's
you walk into the boardroom, the C-suite, all of it's, then you don't have to, But what you're trying to figure out also in terms of the strategy is who is in the org. If it's a small organization, then you can take a look around. But if it's 7,000 people across the globe, you don't know. So you don't know who's in the pipeline. Right. And so even if you walk into the C suite, it might be all of the executive vice presidents or senior vice presidents are all white men. But who are the vice presidents? They may be populating across the globe. So that's where you got to figure out your strategy of who you're going to grow, because you need a promotional strategy, right? You need an internal mobility strategy as well as a recruitment strategy for external. So if you don't have the numbers internally, you have to go externally. If you have some numbers internal, you want to show growth within your company. So you have to figure out who those high potential folks are within the organization, right? And that's going to take some survey to figure out who's in the company, but then also to figure out who's high potential,
and
right?
and you also within that scheme of things, the idea of retention. If you do have
Exactly. So
some
that's the
there, retention is such a big piece. So how do I know that that's where ERGs come in, but again, from the perspective of a company that knows nothing about.
yeah. So that's the first thing is diversity, right? That's why I started with diversity, because diversity numbers do tell you something, right? They tell you if the company is trying to grow their numbers, where they are. The other thing is, if you've seen the numbers flat over time, then you know it's been a revolving door. People have come in, people have gone out, the same number at the same time. So to go back to your point is that for retention, then you're talking about climate, right? And that's that internal mobility piece. So again, the reason you want to show internal mobility is you want to show that people can move from one part of the organization and grow up, right? Because often in organizations, what happens is once you get enough experience, a lot of people of color will leave the organization and go to another organization, right? And to get promoted. But what you actually want to show within your organization is that people have the opportunity to grow. Then the second piece, and that has to do with equity, which is why I started with diversity, because what people are looking for in equity is, are there equitable promotional strategies as a person of color, as a woman, as a gay person, as a person with a disability, right? Can I start as an associate vice president and then move to senior vice president within the same company? Do I see people of color doing that? Do I see women doing that? Right. And that's an equity issue. That's different than diversity. Diversity is the numbers.
Right.
So you can have all the numbers, but if they're all at the bottom of your organization, then you don't have an equity scale.
So,
Right.
so
So
equity is
then
part of the mobility, though, the internal mobility.
equity is part of the mobility, because what you're showing is that everyone has an equal or equitable chance to move up or across the organization, right? So that, and again, you might have to do a survey. A survey might tell you when's the last time people have gotten promoted? How do people feel about the climate? How do people feel about the climate will tell you then what your retention strategy might be. So I'll give you another example. If you're an organization that doesn't have any ERGs, um, employee resource groups or business resource groups. Sometimes what people want to do is start with business resource groups that are all for Black people, all for Latino people, all for, or Latinx, all for people with disabilities, all for queer people. But if you have a small organization, you might only have 2 people in those groups. So you might have to start a group that's generational, right? And that might capture more people, or people who are interested in Black Lives Matter, not just Black people, right? And that would bring a group of interests. So you might start with interest groups, right, to build capacity, particularly in an organization that doesn't have, right, a long history of diversity, inclusion, and equity. And then when you get to inclusion, right, that's really where you're thinking strategically about how are you leveraging those business resource groups or emerging resource groups, employee resource groups, right? Then you might actually convene the group and then ask them for, if you're thinking about recruitment strategies for people of Latinx descent and you have a Latinx, right, ERG, you might employ that group and utilize that group to say, okay, well, what other organizations should we be reaching out to? Should we be reaching out to Alpha in Boston, right? All of those kinds of things. And that group can help you figure out which groups might be more salient, better groups to reach out to than others. And that's the inclusion, because then you're actually leveraging, utilizing the diversity, thinking about the equity in your organization. And that's where you get to that inclusion strategic effort, because then you're including and, right, co-creating with people within your organization.
So is it fair to say, Lisa, that if you have not incorporated any type of strategy for diversity, inclusion, and equity, or diversity,
Yeah.
then the numbers is where you start first, and that is where you get to know the pulse of where you're at.
That's right. From the numbers, you know where you are. If you don't have any people of color, that means probably that your environment is not a hospitable environment for people of color, because it's very hard in the 21st century not to have any people of color at all. I mean, unless you're, I guess, in the middle of maybe Maine, really upstate somewhere, right? Just because Maine is one of the whitest states in the country, in the United States, I'm saying that. But other than that, it's really hard. And so if you don't have any gay people, if you don't have any people with disabilities, right? And so then you have to say, okay, well, what in our organization might not be attractive to those people, right? Is it our reputation? So it might be that the reputation that precedes you, you've had a horrible history historically with people of color or with people with disabilities, right? And so then you have to do something to challenge that history. So if I know my organization's had a terrible history with people of color, I might want to partner with the NAACP. I might want to partner with Alpha. I might want to partner, right, with Ascend, which is the Asian Pacific Islander organization, right? I might want to partner with those organizations, because then I can show, right, that yes, I had a horrible history, but these are the things I'm doing now. Maybe what it is that I fired a whole bunch of people of color at the same time, and my organization still suffers from that. Then I have to demonstrate, right? Then I have to show with my numbers that actually I've hired a whole bunch of other people. That was a long time ago, but now I have a whole bunch of other people, and I even have some people in leadership positions, right? So it depends on what your history has been, what you have to demonstrate currently. And then,
So,
like I said, for the officer who's going in, then they just have to figure out where the organization is and try to build on that.
so again, I want to talk about the companies that don't have
Yeah.
anything, because they're the ones that are really struggling at this point.
Yes,
Right?
they are.
And they really don't even know where to go for this information. And candidly, I think they're afraid to say, hey, this is where I am and I
Yeah.
need help.
Yeah.
So, and they're just doing these hybrids of nothingness.
Yeah, they're doing these. But I keep people keep getting invited to do all these talks, and what I've said is a talk is not going to change your company, right? You can't bring in somebody to do a 2-hour talk in the history of your organization, unless your organization's only been around a year. I mean, other than that, you need more than 2 hours. So it's got to be consistent, transparent, and collaborative.
I like that. What was it?
Consistent, CTC, consistent, transparent, and collaborative. You have to have consistency. You have to show that you're consistently doing this work in diversity, inclusion, and equity. You have to be transparent about the work that you're doing. So if you do a survey, you collect the information, you have to show what you're doing with it, have a strategic plan that is transparent, right? And then you have to be collaborative with the people in your organization, because to go back to your point, they create the climate. So if you're not collaborating and co-creating with the people in the organization, they're either going to be hostile to your diversity inclusion equity efforts, right? Or they're going to say you're not doing what we actually we think is needed, and either are not positive.
So let me ask you this. You have an organization that hasn't changed much, that looks
Yes.
very much across the board the same. Is it feasible to make changes with an organization like that? Or do you need to bring people in, like maybe a new head of HR or a new, maybe the CEO is changing and they've overnight they're thinking that they need to change, but their whole leadership
Yes.
is still in the back, the
Yes.
old ways of doing things. What are
Yes.
the chances that they can actually recover and step forward?
So there are two parts of an organization that are really hard to change, right? The leadership changes a lot, and the bottom of the organization often changes a lot because you just have more people coming in. The middle management and middle people, so middle management and then middle sort of assistants, those don't change a lot. Those are the people who actually often run your organization even if you don't know it. And so sometimes what you have to do, to your point, Josefina, is break that up. You have to do something drastic or dramatic, right? Sometimes what people will do, if you're the CEO, is as people are hiring, you'll say, you might have a hiring pool or hiring slate and say, I won't approve any hiring slates that aren't diverse, right? That sends a very clear message to the company, right? Especially in the middle of the company as opposed to just the highest or the lowest part of the company. Or, we've had a managerial pool that has been, and I mean managerial, I didn't say executive pool, a managerial pool that's been, 90% Caucasian, 90% male. We're going to set a target goal of, not quota, right? We're going to set a target goal of, like Europe is doing. We want to see between 7 and 10% women. We want to see between seven, because that's a range. You have to have a range, right? 7 and 10% people of color in 3 years, right? That's not that's not a quota. That's like time and effort and that kind of thing, right? And then you say, and we're going to hold managers accountable to that. So you will be ranked, right? Or you will get bonuses or whatever. Lots of companies have done those kinds of things, right, to incentivize people to actually do the work, and to learn. The other piece, only other piece I will say is that you have to flood the middle of the organization also with tools, because to go back to what you said, is if people don't have the right tools, meaning they don't know how to do an organizational assessment, right? There are things online that you can use. They don't know how to do an implicit bias test. There are things they can use. You have to give people the tools, because if you just expect them to do it on their own, especially if they've never done it, the fear factor, you're right, enters into it. Like, I'm afraid, but also the factor of the there's the regular fear, but then there's the fear of the unknown, and then there's the fear of doing something wrong, right? And I don't want to offend a whole bunch of people, and that often is the case in diversity, inclusion, and equity.
There's I'm sure you've heard me talk about her, Dr. Stevenson, Karen Stevenson,
Yes.
she's in your neck of the woods. But Dr. Stevenson talks about pulse takers, gatekeepers, and hubs of influence. And I've always thought that when you're hiring and you're hiring a leader of color, if maybe you assign those three people that you can identify, those individuals, I think the success of that person goes up exponentially.
Exponentially. Now, I didn't talk about what the company should do to support. You're exactly right. You as a person, and I like that, right? You have to know where the gates are being kept closed from you. You have to think about the hubs of influence, because you need to be part of those hubs of influence, or at least understand who is influencing right within the company, so that you have that the right relationships with those individuals. So to go back to cultivating what an individual going into a company. So let's say someone's hiring a chief diversity officer, or even just a diversity officer, and they've never hired one before. It's brand new. They haven't had very much effort within the company. Then that's when you have to figure out who your stakeholders are, right, within that company. And that's to go back to, right, who are the gatekeepers, who are the hubs of influence, who are those people who are going to help push the work out for you, right? Who are going to be those people, your posse, as I like to call them, right? Who's in your posse, right? Who are the acquaintances? Those are just the people who are the learners, who are going to say things, but they're not your posse, right? Those are just your ambassadors, your acquaintances. And then, of course, you have your naysayers, and you need to know who they are as well.
Absolutely. I think that's so important throughout, not only in a role as DNI, where that's
In
essential,
every role.
but in every role, in every place that you decide to uh, go to work. I just put up, just so you know, I put up a poll to
I
see.
just saw it.
Good. To see where people are in their organization. And it looks like a lot of folks are just starting in their journey. And they're half and half. We have 67%. I don't know if you can see that on your
I
end.
can't see that. That's okay, though.
Okay, but 67% of the folks that are actually watching us right now on Zoom are in a CDO role.
Okay.
Um, Interestingly enough, that 67% are just started in that role.
Oh,
We're talking about this.
yes.
And then in terms of what the company offers for training, um, most of them offer compliance training and unconscious bias training. I'm going to
Okay.
end the poll now, just so we know where to kind of focus or.
Yeah. Oh, great. I see it now. Yes. Okay. So I would say this: if you have some trainings like unconscious bias training, that's great. If you have some compliance training, that's great. Lots of companies have compliance training because a lot of diversity offices come out of the compliance area, especially for major companies. You're going to need more though. So if you have implicit bias training, what happens sometimes with implicit bias training is people figure out their biases, but they don't know what to do after that. Similarly, with compliance training, they know how to be compliant, but they don't necessarily know how to create a hospitable environment. Being compliant does not necessarily mean that you're inclusive. So let me just give a couple points on that. If you have done implicit bias, the tests, then
Yeah.
what you need to do is figure out not just individual biases. So with your company, there will be, I have biases, Josefina has biases, right? We have biases as individuals, but what you need to figure out is what are the biases of your company? And the biases of the company are different than the individual biases. Now, individuals might make up that, but you have to figure it out. And something, so what I would do is then have the members of your organization, the leadership team, take the implicit bias test, not
Mhm.
just as individuals, but as leaders in their company. And that's a different way of taking the test. So I'll repeat that. I take the test as an individual. What are my individual biases? But what are my biases as a leader? And if you go back to the project implicit, you'll see there are lots of different tests, right? And so those tests you can take in different ways. So that's what I suggest. It's because you have to figure out, and then once you can figure out the organizational bias, and I'll give you just a couple of examples. Some corporations, right, they are biased because they're consumers. They're really, really consumed. I mean, really concerned with what their consumers, right, their current consumers. Some companies are concerned with what the future is going to look like. Everybody thinks about the future, but they think about it differently, right? So you have to think about that and and also you have to think about risk aversion for your company. What's the risk? Banks don't like risk, right? Technology companies love risk. So you have to think about the appetite for risk for your company. Those are the kinds of things that are biases, right? A technology company is very much innovative. They're on fire. That's a bias. A bank is like, we need to be measured, right? That's a bias. Not a good or bad bias. Those biases function for the company. But you have to figure out those biases because then you can figure out how diversity and inclusion and equity are going to work. Because if you're a risk averse environment, then the way you're going to deal with diversity, inclusion, and equity is different than a company that's really innovative. That's
Right.
the kind of thing, right? And that's the kind of thing you have to learn as a DNI professional, right? Because you also have to figure out when you're going into organization, how much risk that organization will take in a given year, a given 2 years, etc. And that will help you then develop your strategic plan. The last thing I'll say is to use those implicit bias tests and the compliance tests. Once you figure out the organizational bias, use those to develop your strategic plan.
Do
You
you
know
have,
your org.
oh,
Yeah.
sorry. Go on. I'm sorry.
No, like I'll just say this last thing. We did a survey at NYU. So I know that there's some things at NYU, the tenure process, or things that are difficult for people to move through. So now I can pay attention to those things and build my strategic plan around those things to be attentive to the bias of my organization to move through those biases.
Now, Lisa, considering that we have so many new CDOs
Yeah.
listening to us, any recommendations on where they can get these tools
Yes.
that maybe at no cost?
Yes.
Maybe they don't have a budget. Maybe they
Yes.
want to get to know these things firsthand before they introduce them to the corporations.
Yes. If you do not have, so let me just give you some free resources. Project Implicit. Project Implicit is a free online. They have lots of tests. Just type Project Implicit into Google. You can do all the implicit bias tests.
Okay, I just
The cultural intelligence test. It's not free the whole thing, but you can do the sample part, and the first part is free. Then, if you want to do any kinds of organizational assessments, that's also with the Project Implicit. You can use those resources. The other resources that I like, if you look up resources from people like Stacey Blake Beard and David Thomas, you can get all the mentoring resources.
okay.
Because again, you want to have very, very strong mentoring programs. Deloitte has some great work on leadership. It's called the 6 Inclusive C's of Leadership. That's Deloitte, and all of their products are online and are free.
What is it again? Deloitte and
Deloitte. And if you go to Deloitte and you do diversity and inclusion, you can get their 6 C's of inclusive leadership. They have a number of great models, and so does PwC, PricewaterhouseCoopers.
Okay.
Yeah, if you go to their websites and go to their diversity and inclusion portals, they have a number of things. If you're in higher education, there are 3 places you can go: the American Council on Education, the American Association of Colleges and Universities, AACU.
Wait. American, say the first one again. I'm just typing it for everyone.
Yeah, American Council of Education. So that's ACE.
Okay.
And then the AACU, which is the American Association of the Colleges and Universities. They have a great website, and they have something called Race Matters. Huge work there.
American Association of
Colleges and Universities. And then you should use, then I'm not going to, these are organizations that you can find a lot of things like the NAACP, the United Negro College Fund, Alpha, Ascend. So all the identity-based organizations, many of them are linked up with corporations. Ascend is one of the largest organizations for people of Asian descent. So all of those identity-based organizations, and there are there's an organization, there are ones for women, and obviously with people with disabilities. So those identity-based organizations, you should Google those and look those up. And they're just too many for me to name. That's the problem. So, but that's how you should start to think about developing the tools, right? And then reading the resources. Yep.
And that's so important, because I think if you have the tools, I love that you said that diversity is about the numbers first. Yes. Knowing what your numbers look like, and then moving your strategy to the inclusion, what that looks like, retention, recruitment, all those are important.
Let me say one thing, because I know some of the people out there are probably like, well, my company thinks we have diversity of thought. And so let me just say this. You cannot have diversity of thought without diversity of people. Our thoughts are formed by our backgrounds, our cultures, the way we're brought up, all of those things. So yes, we have diversity of thought. People of color have thoughts too, but right, we need also people of different backgrounds, different histories, because that's what informs our thoughts, and that comes right out of the work of Scott Page. So all those people who are thinking diversity of their diversity thought, there's a great scholar who wrote that book, and he also says you need diversity of people, means diversity of background, to get those different thoughts.
Well, Lisa, as always, and not only a pleasure, but so much great information. Thank you again. You can catch us every Monday at 1 p.m., and it's all focused on diversity, inclusion, and equity, and some other stuff mixed in.
It's so great to see everybody. Great to see you, Fina. I'm going to go back and enjoy the outside now.
Thank you. We'll talk soon.
We'll talk soon. Bye.